we're in final stages of talking, and we're going to see. Otherwise, it's going to go on for a long time. It'll either end, or it's going to go on for a long time, and millions of additional people are going to be killed. Millions. And nobody wants that.
You see him there, President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky meeting for a 3-hour session Sunday as they search for a deal which could end the war in Ukraine. The talks come as Russia continues its brutal bombing campaign across Ukraine, with 2 people killed and dozens more injured in Ukraine's capital over the weekend. Ukraine is calling for an immediate ceasefire as one of the conditions to end the war. But so far, Russia and Vladimir Putin have refused to stop bombing, something President Trump says he understands.
Not a ceasefire, and that's one of the points that we're working on right now. No, not a ceasefire. He feels that, look, you know, they're fighting and to stop, and then if they have to start again, which is a possibility, he doesn't want to be in that position. But I understand President Putin from that standpoint. You know, you have to understand the other side. And, you know, I'm on the side of peace. I'm on the side of stopping the war.
Joining me now, William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this morning. President Trump says he is on the side of peace. You heard him say there. But after seeing how these talks played out over the weekend, and including those comments you just heard there about Vladimir Putin and the continued bombing, what side do you think he is on?
So, Brian, President Trump knows, we know, that President Putin is the one who is pursuing this war. President Putin can stop this war with a decision tomorrow. But instead, he is bombing Ukrainian civilians. So this is very well understood. And what needs to happen, of course, is for President Trump, if he's serious about wanting to stop this war, to put pressure on President Putin to do exactly that. And President Trump has leverage to do that. It is very clear who started this war. It's very clear who can end this war. But it's going to take pressure from President Trump on President Putin to stop it.
Well, so we hear that Zelensky is insisting that a deal must have a ceasefire first. We hear the president insisting there isn't a need for a ceasefire in this war to bring it to an end. But we know toward the end of the Israel-Hamas war, one senior White House official told the Washington Post President Trump was using, quote, maximum pressure on Israel to accept a ceasefire and hostage deal to end the war. Why do you think the president was willing to use maximum pressure to get a ceasefire in that conflict, but not this one?
Well, Brian, you've answered that. You've answered it exactly in the question. That is, in order to get to the war to end, in order to get Putin to stop killing civilians in Ukraine, in order to stop all the damage that Putin and the Russians are doing, Putin needs to decide, and Putin will decide when President Trump puts pressure on him. And you're right, President Trump knows how to put maximum pressure to get a ceasefire. That's what happened in the Middle East. That's what needs to happen in Ukraine.
And Ambassador, President Trump says there are only a few sticking points that are remaining over a deal, but also said this when asked about what a post-war future looks like.
Russia's going to be helping. Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed. Once, it sounds a little strange, but I was explaining to the president, President Putin was very generous in his feeling toward Ukraine succeeding, including supplying energy, electricity, and other things at very low prices.
Okay, so President Trump says Russia wants Ukraine to succeed as Russia bombs their cities daily. What do you think he's trying to say there?
I have no idea, Brian. Russia clearly wants to destroy Ukraine. And President Putin has been clear about this. He's said this over and over in writing, in speeches. He has said he wants to destroy, eliminate Ukraine. He thinks Ukraine doesn't exist. There is no way that President Putin has good feelings about Ukraine. And yet, frankly, the Ukrainians do not trust President Putin one bit on this.
All right, Ambassador William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sharing new details on the latest proposed peace plan with Russia. Now, this is a day after his high-stakes meeting with President Trump in Florida, and Zelensky telling reporters this morning the plan now proposes that the U.S. guarantees Ukraine's security for 15 years. So, how will Moscow react? We're standing by for President Trump to speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin as soon as today about ending the nearly 4-year war. President Trump yesterday striking a hopeful tone.
We could be very close. There are one or two very thorny issues, very tough issues, but I think we're doing very well. We've made a lot of progress today, but really we've made it over the last month. This is not a one-day process deal. This is very complicated stuff.
CNN's Claire Sebastian is tracking all of this for us. So, Claire, I mean, we've seen President Trump and Zelensky obviously side by side touting potential progress and, in some cases, optimism. But where do we stand right now? What is the latest here?
Yeah, so I think, look, behind those warm words and positive noises, it's clear there is still a lot of work to be done, Omar. That 90% or 95% done numbers that we hear from the Ukrainian president mainly, I mean, I think it's semantic because the 5 or 10% that are left are the biggest issues, the issues mainly of territory, and then the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's biggest power plant that Russia forcibly seized at the beginning of the war and has occupied ever since. That's another of the major sticking points. So I think that is where we stand right now. In terms of next steps, we heard just in the last hour or so from the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says that the next follow-up call after the Zelensky meeting with Trump, another call between Trump and Putin will happen very soon, he said. So we are waiting to hear about that. And President Zelensky this morning, speaking to journalists, has also said that he hopes for a number of next steps, including more meetings next week at advisor level, progressing then to talks with the European leaders under the Coalition of the Willing, and then talks in Washington, he hopes, with those European leaders and President Trump. And then he says at that point he will be ready to speak to Russia in any format they choose. But of course, we have no sense from Russia that they are ready for that or that they are changing their position in any way. So I think, you know, again, despite those warm words and positivity, that conciliatory view that we got of those talks in that press conference, there were some issues for Ukraine. President Trump saying, you know, things are not going well on the battlefield, I'm paraphrasing, so maybe it's worth them making a deal. That really echoes a line that we've been hearing from the Kremlin. He also seemed to praise President Putin for what he's doing with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, saying that it's a big step, that he's not bombing it, at which point you did see President Zelensky shift uncomfortably from one foot to the other. So, look, clearly there's a lot more work to be done. Clearly the biggest issues still remain. And we have an impasse of sorts because, look, Ukraine is moving towards, it says, the idea of discussions on territory. But in order to change the status or give up any territory, President Zelensky seems to suggest that they would need a referendum. And for that, they need a ceasefire. And Moscow has openly rejected any idea of a ceasefire. So that's where we stand at this point.
Yeah, at least 60 days, and that threshold, I mean, you can't even get to one put in place to begin with. So obviously it would be a significant step. Claire Sebastian, appreciate the reporting.